The sound of the sheriff's voice carried across the square that hot June afternoon, his words slicing through the heavy silence like a blade. Last lot of the day. A 19-year-old girl. Healthy. Obedient. Opening bid, $20. His announcement echoed over Lakewood Springs as townsfolk shifted uneasily, some averting their eyes while others stared with a dark curiosity that made the scene even more unbearable. On the makeshift wooden platform stood a thin young woman, her head bowed, tangled hair half hiding a bruise on her cheek. Her parents, faces hardened by years of struggle, looked on with blank expressions as if this moment were not the end of their daughter's freedom, but just another transaction. From the back of the crowd, Isaiah Montgomery stood motionless. At 42, he was the only black landowner in the county, a widower who carried the weight of loneliness and memories that refused to fade. His fists tightened as he watched, anger swelling inside him. He knew the pain of humiliation, the cruelty of injustice. Yet here he was, witnessing another life about to be crushed under the same system. 25, a rough voice barked. Frank Holloway, the tavern owner, smirked as he lifted his hand. His reputation spoke louder than his words, a man who treated women as possessions and saw cruelty as entertainment. The girl shivered visibly. 30, another shout followed. Walter Schmidt, a farmer known for his drunken rages, placed his bid with a wicked grin. Isaiah's jaw clenched. He had just enough money left for seeds, his last chance to salvage his land after the drought. But as he looked at the trembling figure on that platform, something inside him shifted. 50. The single word rolled from Isaiah's deep voice, silencing the crowd. Dozens of heads turned instantly. White faces filled with shock, disgust, and whispered outrage. For a moment, even the sheriff faltered. The girl's father narrowed his eyes, greed flickering across his face. Before he could speak, Isaiah's voice rang out again. 70. In gold. The sheriff cleared his throat nervously. Mr. Montgomery, The law says any free man can bid, Isaiah interrupted firmly. Unless you'd like to explain to a federal judge why you turned down the highest offer. The square froze in silence. For the first time, the young woman raised her eyes. Her gaze met Isaiah's. No hope. No joy. Just exhaustion etched too deeply for her years. 70, once, twice, the sheriff's voice quivered. Sold. His gavel struck, and the murmurs erupted like a storm. God help us, they sold her to a black man, someone hissed. Whispers of hatred stabbed Isaiah from every direction as he walked forward. He handed over the coins, memories flooding him, his late wife Abigail being mocked in this same square, her grave in lonely soil after no doctor dared to treat her illness, the years of grief he had endured. Now here he was, facing their contempt again, but choosing to stand tall. The girl descended from the platform, her steps unsteady. Up close, Isaiah noticed faded bruises on her arms. She kept her gaze fixed on the ground. What's your name? He asked quietly. Sarah, she whispered. Sarah Collins. I'm Isaiah Montgomery, he replied. Her answer startled him. I know who you are. Everybody does. As they left the square, the crowd's voices sharpened into open hostility. Frank Holloway spat on the dirt. $70 is steep, Montgomery. Won't be long before someone takes what you can't hold. Isaiah ignored him, helping Sarah onto his wagon. His old horse pawed the ground, ready to leave the square behind. Sarah trembled, not at his touch, but from fear of what she expected would come next. He leaned closer so only she could hear. I won't hurt you. You have my word. For the first time, she met his eyes directly. He saw something familiar, a flicker of determination, buried under layers of pain. Why? She asked simply. Isaiah didn't answer right away. He flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward. Because I know what it's like to be treated like property. The townspeople's glares burned into his back as they rode away. Yet no one noticed the small metal object hidden in Sarah's worn shoe, nor the glance she cast toward a shadowy figure at the edge of the square. Sarah Collins was not as broken as she seemed. Something was coming, something that would change Lakewood Springs forever. They thought the story ended when Isaiah bought Sarah. But what neither he nor the town knew was that this moment was only the spark, the beginning of a fire that would soon engulf everyone. Isaiah's cabin sat 6 miles from town, nestled against parched fields and a fading oak grove. By the time they arrived, dusk had cloaked the land in blue shadows. "This is it," Isaiah said as he stepped down. "It's not much, but it's mine. No one will bother you here." Sarah lingered on the wagon, eyes scanning the area like a hunted animal, measuring distances, calculating escape routes. When she finally climbed down, she stayed several steps behind. "There's a room in the back," Isaiah offered gently. "It was my son's. It locks from the inside." The mention of a son drew her eyes. "Your son?" "Jacob," Isaiah said quietly. "He died with his mother. Pneumonia. 2 winters ago." His voice carried no self-pity, just fact. Inside, a lamp flickered on the table, though Isaiah hadn't lit it. He stiffened, then checked the rooms quickly. "Relaxing," he said. "Ruth was here. She left food." Sarah tensed at the name. "Ruth Wilkins? The midwife?" Isaiah looked surprised. "You know her?" "She delivered my mother once," Sarah murmured, cautious. The cabin was modest but orderly, books lined neatly, a cedar table polished despite its age, tools arranged with care. It didn't feel like the home of a defeated man, but the refuge of someone who refused to surrender. Over supper, Isaiah studied Sarah. Finally, he spoke softly. "You plan to run tonight, don't you?" Her spoon froze midair. "I don't blame you," he added calmly. "But 3 men are patrolling the eastern woods. Bounty hunters. Hired after 3 escaped slaves disappeared from Sullivan's plantation." "I'm not a slave," Sarah shot back, her voice sharp. "No," Isaiah agreed. "But try convincing them of that in the dark." Sarah wanted to believe escape was possible. But what Isaiah knew, and what she would soon discover, was that the dangers outside his cabin were far deadlier than the fear she carried inside. At dawn, she found the house empty, the front door unlocked. She wasn't a prisoner. Through the window, Isaiah worked in his garden, trying to save dying plants with well water. While searching the shelves, Sarah stumbled across something unexpected, a thick book of federal laws, marked with notes in neat handwriting. Letters beside it bore the signature of a Boston professor. Before she could look closer, the sound of hooves broke the morning calm. Sarah peeked through the window. 3 men dismounted, Frank Holloway, Walter Schmidt, and a tall, polished stranger with cold eyes. Isaiah set down his hoe and walked forward, posture straight, expression steady. "Montgomery," Holloway called with fake cheer. "This here's Judge Davis, our new county judge." The tall man nodded. "We're conducting property inspections. To update records." "My taxes are paid," Isaiah replied evenly. "It's not about taxes," Schmidt sneered. It's about suitability. Unproductive land can be reassigned, Davis explained smoothly. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. This land has been mine since '69. Registered, documented. Times change, Holloway said with a cruel grin. And laws change too. What they didn't know was that Isaiah's land held something far more valuable than crops. And the fight for it had only just begun. The men finally left Isaiah's property, their threats thinly veiled under polite words. Sarah lingered near the doorway, her mind racing. She had seen Holloway's smirk, Schmidt's sneer, and the judge's cold, practiced smile. It wasn't just about the land. They wanted something bigger. Something hidden. When Isaiah returned to the garden, she followed him with cautious steps. "They're not just here for taxes," she said. "They never were," Isaiah replied without looking up. He pressed the hoe into the dry soil, his movement steady. "They've always wanted this land." "But why? It's barely alive." Isaiah paused, then met her gaze. "Because there's something worth more than a few acres of corn." His words were heavy, but he said no more. Sarah didn't push. She'd learned that sometimes silence held more truth than words. Later that afternoon, a wagon pulled into the yard. At its reins sat Ruth Wilkins, the midwife. She climbed down with the confidence of someone used to standing her ground. She carried supplies, seed sacks, and a sharp look that took in every detail. "New judge came by your place today," she said, setting down the bags. "You're not the only one he visited. 5 farms this week, all black or immigrant families." Sarah froze. The pieces started fitting together. "They're clearing land." "Not just clearing," Ruth said grimly. She reached into her satchel and handed Isaiah a sealed envelope. "This came through the telegraph. Jenkins didn't want anyone else to see it." Isaiah opened the note, eyes narrowing as he read. His face hardened with quiet resolve. "Sarah," he said carefully, "what do you remember from your father's meetings with Mayor Marshall?" Sarah's stomach dropped. "How do you know about those?" "Because you're not the first young woman we've tried to help out of that family," Ruth answered gently. The truth struck Sarah like lightning. She wasn't standing in the middle of a stranger's rescue. She was in the middle of a plan. A plan that had been moving quietly long before that auction. Her hand instinctively went to her shoe, where the small ornate key still pressed against her skin. Suddenly, it felt heavier. "My father keeps a red book," she whispered. "Locked in his desk. It has records, payments, names, dates. I've seen him with the mayor. Judge Davis was there too. They're plotting something. Something to do with the land near the river." Isaiah and Ruth exchanged a look. "That book could bring them down," Ruth said. Tears burned Sarah's eyes, the first she'd allowed in days. "That's why he sold me. I knew too much." Sarah thought she was being thrown away. In truth, she had become a threat, one powerful enough to topple men who believed they controlled the whole county. Rumors began to swirl through Lakewood Springs like wildfire. The girl sold to a black man. Strange visitors to Isaiah's cabin. The railroad surveyors spotted near town. But while gossip spread, no one noticed the small red book missing from Collins's desk, or the coded telegraph messages sent late at night. The powerful thought they were untouchable. They didn't see the quiet storm building beneath their feet. Days later, rain hammered the town in an unexpected storm. The streets filled with mud, citizens running for shelter. In the chaos, no one noticed a cloaked figure slipping behind the town hall. Sarah Collins, hidden under the heavy night, pressed the stolen key into the mayor's office lock. The tumblers clicked open. At the same time, miles away, Isaiah stepped into the telegraph office, soaked to the bone. Jenkins gave him a quiet nod. "Wires open to Boston," he whispered before leaving him alone. Isaiah's fingers tapped quickly on the machine, sending words that would change everything. By morning, the town was buzzing. The mayor and his allies gathered in Holloway's tavern, pale with panic. The cabinet was locked, Judge Davis hissed. No one but Marshall had the key. "Documents don't just disappear," the mayor snapped. "Maybe Montgomery," Schmidt started. "Impossible," Marshall cut him off. "That man wouldn't dare step into City Hall." But even as he spoke, 6 copies of the stolen records were being nailed to church doors, market stalls, and the front of City Hall. Ruth Wilkins moved calmly through town, posting the papers one by one. The pages revealed the full scheme: stolen deeds, forged contracts, and plans to reroute the railroad for their own profit. When the church bells struck 10, a train whistled at the station. From it stepped 3 men in fine suits, a Continental Railroad representative, a federal officer, and a reporter from the Boston Globe. They were led down Main Street by Isaiah, straight toward the growing crowd around the pamphlets. "Forgery!" Mayor Marshall shouted, his voice cracking. "Fabricated lies!" The federal officer raised an eyebrow. "And yet, every signature here matches yours. Shall we compare them in court?" The judge tugged nervously at his collar. Schmidt tried to slip out the back door, only to find the sheriff waiting with folded arms. The men who once ruled the county with arrogance were now trapped by their own signatures, and by those they had dismissed as powerless. The crowd pressed tighter, murmurs rising. Faces that once sneered at Isaiah now turned toward him with uneasy respect. But the biggest shock came when the church doors opened and Sarah stepped out, Reverend Thornton by her side. "This young woman," the Reverend announced, "risked everything to bring evidence of crimes that affect us all." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Sarah stood tall, eyes locked on her furious father who had just arrived. "You," Collins growled, surging forward. "I wouldn't," the federal officer warned coolly. "Your daughter has already given us enough to open a federal investigation." The mayor sputtered. "This town belongs to me." "Belonged," corrected the railroad representative. "And the company intends to know why confidential plans were leaked for private gain." The tavern erupted into chaos, shouts, confessions, officers hauling away boxes of evidence. But the square fell silent when Sarah raised her voice. "You sold me," she said steadily, her words echoing. "Just like you sold the dignity of this town." Collins sneered, his last defense venomous. "What did you expect? Your mother ran off because she couldn't stand the sight of you. You were never worth the breath in your lungs." A hush fell over the crowd, until Isaiah's calm voice broke through. "Every person here has the same worth, Mr. Collins. That's the truth you tried to bury. But dignity has no price." In that moment, the battle for land, money, and power became something far greater. It became a fight for the soul of the town itself. By the end of the day, the mayor, judge, and their allies were in custody. But for Isaiah, Ruth, and Sarah, the real fight was just beginning. Because what had started with an auction block was about to reshape the future of Lakewood Springs forever. The dust of the scandal had barely settled when whispers began to ripple through Lakewood Springs. For years, the powerful men of the county had ruled through fear and silence. Now, their secrets were nailed to church doors, read aloud in the marketplace, and carried across state lines by the Boston reporter who had arrived at exactly the right time. But victory brought new dangers. Power does not surrender quietly. Isaiah knew at the moment he saw the railroad representatives examining his land deeds with unusual interest. His property, once dismissed as dry and useless, now sat at the heart of the proposed railroad line. That made him not just a landowner, but a target. Sarah sensed it too. At night she lay awake in the small room Isaiah had given her, the key from her shoe hidden beneath the mattress. She could still hear her father's words in the square, words meant to break her. Instead, they fueled her. For the first time in her life, she was no longer silent. She had spoken out, and the town had listened. Yet, she also knew her father. His cruelty wasn't finished. He would not rest until he clawed back what he believed was his. The men exposed in public humiliation might have been shackled by law, but power has long arms. And the fight for justice was about to test Isaiah and Sarah in ways neither of them had imagined. Weeks passed. Lakewood Springs seemed to transform overnight. Citizens who once whispered in fear now spoke openly of corruption, forging new alliances. The sheriff, long accused of looking the other way, began standing firm, finally choosing the right side of history. Jenkins, the telegraph operator, became a lifeline to Boston and beyond. And Ruth Wilkins, with her quiet authority, became the glue holding it all together. For Sarah, these changes felt surreal. Each day she grew less like the trembling girl on the auction block and more like the woman she was meant to become. She spent hours helping Ruth with letters, carefully transcribing notes, and even daring to speak during meetings at Isaiah's cabin. But trouble wasn't gone. One morning, as Isaiah tended to his fields, a neighbor arrived breathless. "They're saying the judge fled in the night. No one knows where." Isaiah's expression darkened. "That means he's planning something. Men like Davis don't just disappear. They reappear when you least expect them." And he was right. Reports trickled in of the judge spotted in Chicago, under another name, trying to maneuver his way back into influence. The reminder was clear: the system they had challenged was far bigger than their county. That evening, Ruth arrived again, bringing not just supplies but news. "The Continental Railroad has decided the route. It will cut through your land, Isaiah. Not Marshall's." Isaiah nodded slowly. "That's why they wanted it. Not for farming, not for timber. For control of the line." Sarah's chest tightened. "So what happens now?" Isaiah looked at her, his eyes steady. "Now we make sure they can't take it again." What began as survival for Isaiah and Sarah had turned into something larger. They were no longer just defending a farm. They were guarding the key to the town's entire future. The transformation wasn't only on paper. Construction crews soon arrived, setting up rail lines and wooden scaffolds. The quiet edge of Isaiah's property buzzed with new energy. Men shouted directions, hammers rang against iron, and wagons hauled stone from miles away. The town had never seen anything like it. Businesses sprouted. Families who once struggled now found work. For the first time in years, hope mingled with the sound of train whistles. But with opportunity came tension. Old resentments didn't vanish overnight. Some white townsfolk resented seeing Isaiah's land at the center of progress. Others whispered that Sarah's role in exposing the corruption was a disgrace that would never be forgiven. One afternoon, as Sarah walked through the market, she heard the whispers plainly. "There she is. The girl who betrayed her own father. Shameful. Should have kept her mouth shut. Sarah kept her chin high, though her hands trembled. She returned to the cabin, where Isaiah found her staring into the distance. "They'll never see me as anything but a traitor," she murmured. Isaiah set down the tools he carried. "You're not a traitor. You're the reason they even have a future. Never forget that." She looked at him, searching his face. "But what about you? Doesn't it ever wear you down? The stares, the hatred?" Isaiah smiled faintly, though his eyes were tired. "Every day. But dignity doesn't come cheap. If we stop fighting, they win." Sarah was learning the hardest lesson of all, that victory doesn't end the fight. It only begins a new battle to hold on to what has been won. Months passed. The railroad station began to take shape, an iron skeleton rising against the sky. And on Isaiah's land, something else was built, a small wooden structure that would change the town in ways no one expected. It started with 3 children. Black children who had been turned away from the town school. Sarah, restless for purpose, began teaching them letters and numbers under the oak tree. Soon, more came, immigrant children, poor white children, all those denied a place elsewhere. Isaiah watched her one afternoon, her voice steady as she guided the children through a lesson. Pride swelled in him. "You found your fire," he told her later. "I never thought I'd be a teacher," she admitted softly. "You always were. You just needed someone to believe it." Her eyes softened. For the first time, the walls she had built around her heart began to lower. Meanwhile, justice continued its slow march. Former Mayor Marshall, stripped of his power, was sentenced for fraud and extortion. His name, once feared, became a byword for disgrace. Holloway lost his tavern to creditors. And Sarah's father, Collins, spiraled into ruin, a shadow of the domineering man he had been. Yet even as the town rebuilt, Sarah's past still clung to her. Late at night, she would touch the small scar on her wrist, a reminder of her father's cruelty. Isaiah noticed, but never pressed. He knew that some wounds take longer to heal than others. Outwardly, the town was moving forward. But beneath the surface, scars remained, personal scars that no trial or railroad could erase. One evening, Ruth gathered the small circle, Isaiah, Sarah, Jenkins, and the sheriff, around the cedar table in the cabin. She carried with her another letter. "It's from Benson," she announced. Isaiah's eyes lit up. Benson, the professor from Boston who had once guided him through federal law, was more than a mentor. He was part of the reason Isaiah had bought this land in the first place. "He accepts the proposal," Ruth continued. 15 scholarships for our young people here. 15 chances for futures none of them could have dreamed of. Sarah's breath caught. 15 lives transformed. She touched her wrist again, this time not in pain, but in wonder. Isaiah placed a hand on the table, his voice steady. "This is just the beginning." What started as an act of defiance in a dusty square had grown into something no one had imagined. A community reborn, not through revenge, but through building a better future. 6 months had passed since the day the square erupted with truth. Lakewood Springs was no longer the same town. The once sleepy settlement had transformed into a place buzzing with change. The new railroad station rose proudly on the edge of Isaiah Montgomery's property, its iron towers standing tall against the horizon. Each train that thundered through brought not just goods and passengers, but also the symbol of a new era. For Isaiah, the land that men once tried to steal had become the center of progress. His small cabin now stood beside something greater, a wooden schoolhouse that had grown from Sarah's simple lessons under the oak tree. What began with 3 children had become a gathering of 20, their voices filling the air with laughter and recited lessons. Black, white, immigrant, it didn't matter. They sat together, side by side, and learned as equals. Sarah Montgomery, as the town now knew her after her quiet wedding to Isaiah performed by Reverend Thornton, stood at the heart of it all. Her voice, once barely above a whisper, now carried authority and warmth as she guided her students. Each time she wrote a word on the chalkboard, she defied the chains that had once threatened to silence her forever. The girl who had been sold like a possession was now shaping the minds of the next generation. But even as the town celebrated progress, shadows of the past still lurked. Not everyone welcomed the changes. In dim corners of taverns and back rooms, bitter voices whispered. Some grumbled that the railroad should never have favored Montgomery's land. Others hissed that Sarah's presence in the school was a disgrace. Traitor, one man muttered under his breath as Sarah passed through the market. Should have stayed in her place. She held her head high, but the word stung. That night, she confessed to Isaiah as they sat together by the fire. "They'll never forgive me," she said softly. "Not for what I did. Not for who I am." Isaiah looked at her with calm strength. "Forgiveness isn't what we're after, Sarah. We're building something stronger than their hatred. Something they can't tear down." She wanted to believe him. And deep down, she did. Still, the wounds left by her father's cruelty and the town's judgment healed slowly. Meanwhile, justice continued to ripple outward. Former Mayor Marshall, stripped of his title, now sat in a cold prison cell, convicted of fraud and extortion. Judge Davis, unmasked as a disgraced lawyer, had fled under cover of night. Reports later confirmed he had been arrested in Chicago under another name. Frank Holloway, once so smug, lost his tavern and ended up working as a laborer on the river docks. And Sarah's father, Collins, had fallen into ruin. Once feared, he now shuffled through town as a broken man, avoided by neighbors who had once courted his favor. He survived on scraps of kindness, his arrogance replaced by pitiful dependence. For Sarah, this knowledge brought no joy, only a quiet sense of closure. The powerful men who thought they could buy and sell lives were gone. Yet their downfall raised a new question: what comes after victory? The answer began to appear in small but powerful ways. Every week, Isaiah, Sarah, Ruth, Jenkins, and the sheriff gathered for dinner, discussing how to guide the town forward. Ruth often brought news, her sharp eyes always catching details others overlooked. Jenkins updated them on messages from Boston. And the sheriff, once timid, now carried himself with pride, finally standing as a protector of all, not just the powerful. One evening, Ruth arrived with news that made everyone lean closer around the cedar table. "Benson has accepted," she announced, her voice firm but her eyes bright. Isaiah's lips curved into the faintest smile. Benson, the professor from Boston who had once corresponded with him, had been more than a mentor. He had been the first to tell Isaiah that knowledge of the law could be a weapon against injustice. "He'll provide scholarships," Ruth continued. 15 of them, for young people here. From our community." Sarah's eyes widened. 15 lives changed forever. Her words carried weight. She remembered her own hopeless nights, believing there was no escape from her father's grasp. Now she would help give others the future she almost never had. The day of the railroad's official opening arrived like a festival. The station gleamed, decorated with flags and flowers. A crowd filled the platform, buzzing with excitement. The new mayor, an honest merchant elected after Marshall's fall, gave a speech about progress and unity. But the people's eyes drifted again and again to the Montgomerys standing quietly to the side. "It's because of you," an elderly woman whispered to Sarah as she passed. This was the same woman who once crossed the street to avoid her. "My son has a job at the station now. They would have never hired a boy like him before." Sarah turned and saw a young man with a limp wave proudly from the platform, dressed in a railroad uniform. Her smile came naturally this time. "We didn't do it alone," she said kindly. Isaiah, overhearing, leaned close. "That's what they'll never understand about justice. It's not just about punishing the guilty. It's about building something better on the ruins." The railroad's arrival wasn't just steel and smoke, it was proof that a community, once divided and ruled by fear, could be rebuilt on hope and dignity. That evening, Sarah and Isaiah walked home under the fiery glow of sunset, the station towers silhouetted against the sky. The air carried the hum of trains, mingling with the laughter of children in the distance. "When I was on that platform, being sold like an animal," Sarah admitted, her voice quiet, "all I wanted was revenge. I wanted them to suffer the way I did." Isaiah listened, his face calm in the fading light. "But now," she paused, looking at him with steady eyes. "Now I know freedom isn't just about breaking chains. It's about building a table where everyone has a seat." Isaiah reached for her hand, his voice gentle but strong. "They tried to convince us we were worthless. That you were nothing more than a commodity, and I was nothing but an intruder on this land. But we proved them wrong. Our worth was never theirs to decide." They stood in silence, watching as lanterns flickered in the town below, each light a reminder that change was real. From the ashes of betrayal and cruelty, a new foundation had been laid. But Isaiah and Sarah knew the journey wasn't over. The true revolution had only begun. The train whistles became part of daily life in Lakewood Springs. Each morning, steam curled above the new station, iron wheels thundered over the tracks, and people gathered to watch as goods and passengers arrived from faraway places. What was once a forgotten town now pulsed with energy, trade, and new beginnings. Isaiah's land, nearly stolen, nearly stripped from him, had become the beating heart of that progress. The sight of it filled him with quiet pride. Yet, pride was not his driving force. What mattered most was what came next, ensuring this new foundation would not crumble under greed or corruption again. Sarah felt the same. Every day, as she stood before her class, she carried not just chalk and lessons but a responsibility. The children who filled the benches came from every corner, black families once turned away, immigrants who had arrived with nothing, and even white children whose parents now saw more promise in unity than division. Under Sarah's guidance, they were building a future that couldn't be bought or sold. What had started as survival for Isaiah and Sarah was no longer just their fight. It had grown into a movement that could reshape generations. But change never comes without resistance. In the taverns and alleyways, bitterness simmered. Some townsfolk couldn't accept that the very people they once dismissed now stood at the center of power. They whispered about Isaiah's influence, about Sarah's school, about the scholarships being sent to Boston. One evening, as Isaiah walked back from the station, a voice called out from the shadows. "You think this town belongs to you now?" 3 men stepped forward, their faces twisted with anger. Old resentments shone in their eyes. Isaiah stood firm. This town belongs to itself. And to every person willing to build it. The men hesitated, but the fire in his voice left no room for challenge. They spat insults and disappeared into the dark, but Isaiah knew it was a warning. Progress had enemies. When he returned home, Sarah noticed the tension in his shoulders. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked. "No," he admitted. "But neither will we." Weeks later, Ruth arrived with more news from Boston. She carried letters sealed in official envelopes. "Benson has confirmed the scholarships," she said, placing them on the table. "The first group will leave in the fall. 15 young men and women from here will have a chance to study, to rise, to lead." Sarah touched the papers with reverence. She thought of the children in her classroom, the laughter that filled the air, the determination shining in their eyes. 15 lives, she whispered. 15 doors opened. Ruth smiled. And once one door opens, others follow. The small circle that once gathered in Isaiah's cabin was no longer just fighting against injustice. They were planting seeds of change that would stretch far beyond Lakewood Springs. But not everyone celebrated. In the wreckage of his former life, Collins, Sarah's father, still nursed his bitterness. Stripped of wealth, abandoned by allies, and despised by the townsfolk, he wandered like a ghost. Yet his hatred remained sharp, and his humiliation festered. Rumors spread that he had been seen near the station, muttering to himself, drinking heavily, cursing his daughter's name. Some pitied him. Others feared what desperation might drive him to do. Sarah tried not to think about him. Yet, late at night, the memory of his words, "You were never worth the air you breathed," echoed in her mind. She fought against them each morning as she faced her students, determined to prove him wrong. Isaiah, sensing her turmoil, reminded her gently, "You are not his words, Sarah. You are your own. And you've already proven more than he ever imagined." As spring turned to summer, the first commercial train pulled into Lakewood Springs Station. The ceremony drew the whole town. Music played, flags waved, and children ran alongside the gleaming cars. The new mayor gave a speech about renewal, progress, and the promise of unity. But as the applause rose, all eyes drifted once more to the Montgomerys. Isaiah stood tall, steady as always. Sarah held the hands of 2 children who clung to her side, symbols of the very future she was helping to shape. An elderly man stepped forward, his voice trembling but loud enough for all to hear. "It's because of them. Because they didn't give up." The crowd murmured in agreement. Even those who once spat Isaiah's name now saw him differently. Respect, grudging, reluctant, but real, had taken root. The community that once turned its back now stood on the shoulders of the very people it had tried to destroy. And though the past could not be erased, the future was being rewritten. That evening, Sarah and Isaiah walked the dirt road back to their cabin, the sky glowing orange above the horizon. "When I first stood on that auction block," Sarah admitted, her voice steady but soft, "I thought my life was over. I thought I would never be anything but a possession." Isaiah glanced at her, the corners of his mouth lifting faintly. "But now," she continued, "I understand something. Freedom isn't just breaking chains. It's building something no one can take away." Isaiah nodded. "They wanted us to believe we were worthless. That our dignity could be sold, like cattle or land. But they were wrong. Dignity can't be priced. It's lived. Every day." Her hand slipped into his, the silence between them filled with a quiet strength. They had come so far. Yet, both knew their work wasn't finished. The story that began with an act of defiance had become something more, a testament that true change comes not with vengeance, but with vision. In the weeks that followed, the school grew, the station thrived, and the once divided town began to stitch itself together. A council was formed, representing every group, black, white, immigrant, meeting weekly to guide the town's progress. It was not perfect. Arguments erupted, old prejudices resurfaced, and setbacks tested their resolve. But progress was no longer a dream. It was happening, brick by brick, voice by voice. And at the center of it all stood Isaiah and Sarah, not as saviors, but as proof that dignity, once defended, could become the foundation for everyone. The sun rose over Lakewood Springs, casting long golden beams across a town that no longer resembled the one from a year ago. Where suspicion and silence once ruled, now there was movement, sound, and ambition. The new railroad station bustled with activity, workers loading crates, travelers stepping off carriages, and children chasing each other along the edge of the platform. Isaiah Montgomery stood at the edge of it all, watching with quiet pride. His land, once threatened with seizure, had become the foundation of prosperity. Yet, he never forgot the cost. He knew that progress wasn't just measured in steel and timber. It was measured in lives changed, in dignity defended, in futures reclaimed. Sarah stood nearby, surrounded by her students. Their chatter filled the air as she organized them for a reading exercise beneath the station's wide awning. She had grown into her role, not just as a teacher, but as a leader. The same young woman who once trembled on an auction block now held the attention of a room, or a crowd, with calm confidence. From the ashes of cruelty and humiliation, Sarah had risen into a figure of hope. But even in a town reborn, reminders of the past never truly vanished. Her father, Collins, was one such reminder. Stripped of power and influence, he drifted through the streets like a shadow. Once a man who demanded respect, he now avoided eye contact, his voice slurred by drink, his clothes ragged. Where he had once been feared, he was now pitied, or ignored. One afternoon, Sarah saw him standing at the edge of the station platform, watching her from a distance. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, she felt nothing, no fear, no anger, no sorrow. Just clarity. His cruelty no longer defined her. His words, once weapons, had lost their sting. She turned back to her students, leaving him behind. In that moment, she understood, forgiveness was not about excusing what he had done. It was about refusing to let his hatred shape her future any longer. Meanwhile, the town council began to meet regularly. For the first time in memory, the room was filled with diversity, black, white, immigrant, debating fiercely but working together. It was not always smooth. Arguments erupted, voices rose, old prejudices surfaced. But the very fact that such voices were present in the same room marked a revolution. Ruth Wilkins watched with satisfaction. The midwife who had once fought in the shadows now saw her community finding its voice. Jenkins, once just the telegraph operator, became the town's connection to the wider world, his machine tapping day and night with news, opportunities, and alliances. The sheriff, once timid, now stood proudly as a protector of all, his badge finally meaning what it always should have. And Isaiah, once seen as an outsider, a man to be scorned, was now consulted, respected, even admired. His calm wisdom became a cornerstone of the council's debates. The same town that once spat on Isaiah's name now leaned on his guidance. The winds of change had shifted, but they came at the price of resilience, sacrifice, and courage. 6 months after the first train rolled through, Benson's scholarships took effect. 15 young men and women boarded carriages, bound for Boston. The town gathered to see them off, cheering as the train carried them toward futures once unimaginable. Sarah wiped a tear as she waved goodbye. She remembered the girl she had been, silent, bruised, resigned to a life of obedience. And she saw in those students the proof that the cycle could be broken. Isaiah placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is what it was always about," he said softly. She nodded. Not just surviving. Not just winning. But making sure the next generation never has to fight the same battles. Life at the school continued to expand. Desks filled every corner, and lessons spilled outside under the oak tree on warm days. Sarah spoke often to her students about dignity, courage, and truth. "They tried to break me," she told them once, her voice steady. "But they forgot something. Sometimes, broken things reflect light in ways whole things never could." Her words sank deep. The children listened with wide eyes, sensing the weight behind them even if they could not yet grasp it fully. The greatest legacy of Isaiah and Sarah was not the downfall of corrupt men, but the rise of a new generation that would grow up knowing their worth. Former Mayor Marshall remained behind bars. Judge Davis, caught under another name, was locked away in Chicago. Holloway worked docks far from home. And Collins, once the architect of his daughter's suffering, wandered unnoticed, stripped of everything. Justice, imperfect but real, had done its work. But Isaiah always reminded his students, justice is not only about punishing the guilty. It's about building something better on the ruins. And that's what they had done. As the sun set one evening, Isaiah and Sarah stood together on the hill above town. The towers of the station glowed in the fading light, trains whistling in the distance. The school below buzzed with children preparing for the next day. The council chamber lights flickered as men and women debated inside. "This all began," Isaiah said quietly, "the day I raised my voice in that square. The day I chose not to look away." Sarah slipped her hand into his. "And the day I chose not to stay silent." They stood together, watching as the town they had both risked everything for stretched out below them. What began as survival had become transformation. What began with pain had become purpose. Neither Isaiah nor Sarah had ever dreamed of changing the world. But by refusing to surrender, they had changed everything. The story of Lakewood Springs became more than a local tale. Visitors arrived from other towns, curious about the school, the council, the railroad. Articles appeared in newspapers, telling of a black landowner and a young woman once sold at auction who defied a system meant to crush them. Their story spread, not as a legend, but as a lesson. That dignity is not for sale. That courage can turn whispers into revolutions. That even in the face of humiliation and betrayal, human worth cannot be erased. And for Isaiah and Sarah, that was enough. If this story of resilience, courage, and justice touched you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that remind us of a timeless truth: no matter the obstacles, dignity has no price, and hope can rewrite even the darkest chapters of history.